Welcome to Elemental Energy, where we simplify decarbonization. As the world continues to consume more and more energy, we must figure out how to meet its demands while ensuring the power we generate is reliable, clean, and affordable. By bridging the gap between oil and gas and electricity and decarbonizing steps along the way, there's a good chance we can achieve energy sobriety. I'm your host, Marcia Leonard. Everybody, today is a conversation about energy policy. This was something that was near and dear to my heart because I didn't fully understand all of energy policy being tied into the micro of my job and delivering projects. I had never really thought about energy policy and the broader picture of how it affects getting projects across the finish line. So I had the pleasure of meeting Nicholas McMurray, also known as Nico, at the USNIC conference, or the Nuclear Conference for Small Modular Reactors and Other Innovations Technology around Nuclear, back in May. And when I heard him speak, I was like, yes, sir, this is the person we are bringing in to talk energy policy. Nico, welcome to Elemental Energy.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Nico, please go ahead and introduce yourself a bit further.
Yeah, so name's Nico McMurray. I'm the Managing Director of International and Nuclear Policy at ClearPath, which is an organization in Washington, D.C., broadly focused on federal clean energy policy. And so we think about a wide variety of different technologies: nuclear, carbon capture, geothermal, hydropower, energy storage in the power sector, a lot of technologies in heavy industry and manufacturing, such as hydrogen, steel, and cement. And then carbon dioxide removal technologies like direct air capture. We have an agriculture program, and then the cross-cutting policies to help figure out what is it going to take to build and commercialize them, thinking things like tax and permitting and exports of US technologies. And so we have a policy team with expertise in all of those. We also have a government affairs team with backgrounds in Congress from the House and Senate and appropriations, looking at what is the pathway to take some of these ideas and actually make them reality to support US companies that are trying to build all of those different technologies that I just listed.
And what I heard as the foundation of all that is decarbonization, emission reduction through all of the different energy sources, right?
We definitely think that policy is the key to reduce emissions. And the only way to do that is through innovative technologies. And so when we view what policy is and why it's really important, it can really unlock, the construction and the financing and ultimately the export of everything that we need.
You mentioned a word that I have been really hooked on right now is innovation. Is the more and more I've learned about the current energy landscape, I don't believe it's an energy transition. I believe that we are just going through an innovation period. And this is one of the finest moments. And we're innovating around how we reduce emissions. So let's start getting into policy and how it does affect and drive these projects.
Yeah, so looking at policy, you think about the deployment of any new technology, kind of the S curve of deployment. You have the basic research and development, you start building some small demonstrations, and then you're really working on getting it to, the early deployments in the market, and then ultimately the widespread deployments. And so when we look at policy, we're trying to focus in on each of these different parts. And so here in the US, we have the Department of Energy and the national labs, which have incredible resources to support all these private industry innovators looking at what it's going to take to build that next generation carbon capture facility or long duration energy storage or decarbonize the cement or steel sectors. And so we really look at it, how are we trying to commercialize these technologies and build out the research and development, the demonstration, addressing maybe some of those regulatory barriers that are really critical for not just building one facility, but many facilities. First of a kind plants are usually more expensive, or they don't have a fully developed market. And so are there certain market signals or policies like tax credits that can help de-risk those early stage deployments to, really get them out there? And then, ClearPath, we're really trying to look globally, where how can America lead on deploying these technologies, not just here, but also abroad? And so that's where we're starting to look at what are policies to help export a lot of these technologies on the financing side or the trade side, or even regulatory barriers for export.
Nico, I want to scratch the surface a bit deeper with you as an individual and tell me why and how you are vested in the policy side of things because it's such a niche area.
Yeah, it's definitely a little bit by accident. So my background's in engineering, so went to school for engineering and material science. And when I was there, I got involved doing research through the nuclear engineering department. And I thought it was really interesting, some of these new technologies focused on the material selection, but really got exposed to technology I hadn't really thought about. I also had the opportunity then to intern at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or the NRC, which is the government regulator for civilian nuclear power. So think of things like power plants and medical isotopes. The NRC regulates those facilities. So I interned there down in the Atlanta office looking at new construction. So from my perspective, I just kept seeing new projects, new builds, get to walk around on a construction site, which is always fantastic. And so went back, thought had a great experience. I graduated. I briefly worked for a steel company. Then I had the opportunity to move to Washington, D.C. to work for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I was part of their development program, getting up to speed on all these technologies, on the regulations and how the NRC actually operates. And by the end of my time there, I was really 100% focused on new and advanced reactors. So the next generation of technologies that either were being built, that the NRC was reviewing and approving, or kind of these new technologies of helping the NRC try to figure out how is it going to license these new technologies that look very, very different than a gigawatt plus scale reactor. So I was there for many years, and then I had the opportunity to join ClearPath, where thinking through some of these new technologies and the barriers around that, I started to recognize it was more than just regulatory as the challenge. And so had the opportunity to join ClearPath to figure out what are the different policies, what are things that Congress can do to help support, allow the NRC to do its job even better. What are policies that can help de-risk these demonstrations of all these new technologies and companies that I started to learn about when I was at the NRC? And so I've been at ClearPath for several years now, really have a great opportunity to not just think about the regulatory topics, but think about everything else along, that S curve of deployment, and how can the Department of Energy, the labs, Congress, policymakers really enable private industry to succeed and be successful.
Let's expand on that because when I went down the rabbit hole of research on energy policy, I had to pull myself back up and recognize that it's rules, it's principles, it's guidelines, but how do we come together in order to establish those rules, principles, and guidelines?
Yeah, you have to take a holistic approach where there's not just one policy or one idea that is going to commercialize the technology. And so, ClearPath thinks very carefully around what are we focused on that is going to support US technologies to be built. And looking at it through that lens, really able to hone in on what are the educational opportunities for policymakers so they can understand the technologies. What are the different challenges that private industry is facing with their specific technology? How is that broadly applicable across multiple companies or even multiple industries? And then we can go back and really think about, okay, is there a solution here? Is there a policy solution? Is it a program? Is it a bill? Is it a regulation? Is it implementing a regulation with guidance? What could that look like? And so as we approach, what is it going to take to build all of these clean energy technologies, we do try to look holistically of it's not just one piece of the puzzle. We really have to look across that entire life cycle because ultimately these technologies have to be cost competitive. They have to raise private capital. You have to be able to deploy not just one or two, but maybe hundreds of these, facilities, not just in the US, but globally. And so that's, where every day is very different, every week is very different. And, since joining ClearPath, learned so much about, how to work through these areas, talk to a lot of different folks who are, have different backgrounds and areas of expertise, and try to really pull that all together into a way that actually can be impactful.
I'm curious about the engagement level of engineering firms and people who are actually building these facilities, because it sounds like they would be your best sounding board for realistic implementation and what these projects look like.
So something that I didn't really appreciate until after joining ClearPath is with my background from both the technical and the regulatory side, how applicable that is for thinking through policy. And so I think that's actually a really great opportunity of, the private companies that I talk to, the engineering firms I talk to, even the folks on the financing side who are really trying to crunch the numbers. All of those skills and backgrounds are really, really important because, again, as you said, you're trying to build things. And so you need the companies that are looking to build to be engaged and invested. And so when I'm talking with, companies to understand their technologies, I'm trying to think through, okay, what is that barrier that's not just, does it work, but is there something else, leveraging the resources that, the federal government has at the DOE from research and development, or a program that can help de-risk costs or timelines, or on the regulatory side, is this necessary anymore for some of these new technologies? Does this regulation make sense for something that is wildly different than what's in operation today? And so the closer we get beyond kind of the basic research and development for some of these ideas, the more and more important it's going to be to pull in those conversations with people who finance projects, for people who build large, complex, facilities, and in many cases, haven't been engaged before. And so that's where, like, looking ahead, I'm really excited because in the nuclear space in particular, there's so much enabling policy for many of these first of a kind projects. And now it's really a question of what is it going to take to be able to scale them beyond just one project, but two, 10, 20, hundreds.
So we have the background of what energy policy is. We've talked about how it structures to come to fruition. Let's talk about a real policy. Let's talk about something that's out there today that's really making an impact.
Looking over the last 4+ years, there's been a lot of large bipartisan policies because our goal is really bipartisan policy. So it's durable for companies to make the billions of dollars of investment decisions that they need to make, that have really started to move and frankly accelerate the construction and commercialization of a lot of different technologies of everything I listed earlier. Starting Energy Act of 2020, bipartisan bill, a lot of different standalone bills authorized over 20 different demonstration programs in nuclear, geothermal, long duration energy storage, carbon capture, direct air capture, CO2 pipelines, hydrogen. And so, really looking across all of these different suites of technologies to try to figure out, what are the gaps and how can these companies be supported to build these first of a kind projects? A lot of those programs were then funded in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And so you're seeing where policymakers on both sides of the aisle are recognizing the need for clean, reliable, and affordable energy and the wide suite of technologies that can accomplish that. Recently, multiple tax credits, again, looking along that S curve of what is it going to take to de-risk those early deployments and help those different technologies get to market. So tax credits on all these clean energy technologies, hydrogen, carbon sequestration, that these underlying policies do have a lot of support, bipartisan support, industry support, and can really act as a key enabler for commercialization. So a lot of great policy happening, and we're always trying to look ahead to see what else is still out there that needs to be done. The big challenge in many cases is the permitting process. And so, we want to build a lot of technologies and you just can't because the permitting process is either, it's too slow, it doesn't quite make sense for some of these new technologies. And so we're trying to figure out then what are the different policy solutions to fix that. You've had actually a lot of interest in this area. Again, bipartisan interest, both sides of the aisle, trying to look at what policies make sense. There are some provisions in the Fiscal Responsibility Act that really try to, update the National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA, really trying to figure out, okay, if we're going to build a lot of these technologies, how do we do it that, still safe, still meets all the environmental provisions, but just isn't an undue barrier. And so we're continuing to look at that kind of across all of these technologies, and then also at the technology specific level for things like nuclear or geothermal or carbon capture.
Now, I didn't screen this question with you beforehand, so feel free to pass if you'd like. But my concern is we've done all this amazing work. How secure are these policies with the upcoming election year? Because I don't know if there's anything technical in place to protect them. Just educate me on the election cycle and how it might affect our current energy policy, please.
Yeah, another great question. And we have seen just incredible bipartisan interest in all of these technologies. And I think, you know, no one will know how the election will shake out, but private industry is moving forward. Policymakers are very supportive. On the nuclear front, it is almost unheard of the level of bipartisan support for nuclear technology. I mean, bills passing with only like single digit or 10 different no votes, but either in the Senate or in the House. Fingers crossed next week, another very bipartisan bill called the Advance Act in the Senate will hopefully be enacted into law. And so you're seeing where policymakers are coming together, looking at the importance of these technologies, looking at U.S. leadership in deploying these technologies. In the economy, you're seeing the demand growth that is happening from manufacturing and data centers, where it's really driving industry to want to deploy these technologies quickly. And so policymakers are taking note of that, a lot of the conversations that we're having. And so it's trying to figure out in many cases how to do this even better or even faster.
I'm really happy to hear that. All of it. I was concerned, and I think it was just lack of education. So thank you for sharing that with me. Something that I kind of recognized is that climate policy and energy policy can typically be interchanged. They are not two different things necessarily, are they?
If you look at the highest level, energy policy, pulling in clean energy technologies in many cases makes sense. And you're seeing that's where there's a lot of innovators across all of the technologies I mentioned, looking at what is it going to take to build these new technologies. You have larger, incumbent entities, the workshop down in Houston that we were at, looking at the different petrochemical companies, looking at nuclear energy. You're having, steel companies and cement companies looking at, carbon capture or new ways of doing things to produce whatever materials they need. And so you're really seeing this continuous drive of, innovation for new companies, for established companies. You're seeing this demand growth for electricity. You're seeing globally this need for just energy in general. And that's really helping industry think long term about what is it going to take to commercialize these technologies. You're seeing the interest in Congress around, okay, we recognize that energy security is national security. And so making sure that the US can produce these resources here globally, can we work with our allies to export these technologies. You're really seeing policymakers come together, industry come together, and really try to move forward to again build a lot of technologies that we know we need.
Now, just talking through that with you, I see now how energy policy can be a subset of climate policy, but they are really hand in hand because of how much impact the energy industry does have on the climate.
Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, everyone needs energy. I mean, that's really really key. In DC, it's going to be really really warm these next couple of days, so everyone's going to have their air conditioning on. So having reliable and affordable energy is necessary for industry. It's necessary for jobs. Necessary for everything. And as you're looking at new manufacturing, data centers, whatever that may be, that's all jobs. That's good. And so the key to that is then having that energy that can support all of this. And that's where, how do you make energy reliable, affordable, and clean? And that's really where, industry is focused on for a lot of these new nuclear technologies, geothermal technologies, and some of the recent announcements coming out of that. And even in industry, looking at things like carbon capture, also looking at nuclear. And it's kind of this all of the above approach that's really, really resonating across industry and in Congress.
One of the biggest rebuttals that I hear when I'm trying to educate people on the energy transition, which I really don't like that term, this current energy innovation that we're undergoing, is that, you know, across the seas, they are building coal plants on a weekly basis. And it's really the United States is trying to form such a strong energy policy around innovation and technology, but nobody else is actually going to take up those policies or those practices. And I always come back with, well, you know what? Somebody has to start somewhere in order to make these designs standardized, affordable, and be able to transcend that into other nations. But is there anything else that you can help from a global perspective of how do we take these policies that we're implementing here strongly and take them into a global arena?
Yeah, it's a really important question that we are trying to dive into more and more, where you're seeing, again, a lot of US companies building a lot of these new technologies. And for many of them, relatively easy to, export. For some of them, nuclear being a great example, it's many different federal agencies to make sure that they're all working together for export and regulatory and financing pieces. And so from there, there's probably a policy solution to help make it easier to export US nuclear technologies abroad, especially because many other countries like China and Russia are really interested in exporting their technologies. And so you're seeing this overlap between energy security, national security, clean energy, reliability, where that's one example that policy can be a real enabler. Another area we're looking at is on the financing side, where U.S. agencies, the International Development Finance Corporation, the Export Import Bank have a really important role to export U.S. technologies, abroad, and that can be almost anything. And so, looking at those agencies and the tools that they have, is there a way to give them more tools, supercharge what they already have in order so U.S. companies can be more competitive, especially when they're looking at some of these state-owned enterprises that are able to offer really, really lucrative financing that any private company just can't compete with. And so it's really trying to lay the groundwork for what does it take for technologies to be cost competitive so they can be exported. And then when they're being exported, are there different barriers to make it easier for US companies to compete in the global marketplace?
Nico, I feel if we get any deeper on it, it's going to turn into like a 200 level course for energy policy.
We can have that
But
next time.
I would love that. But what I would like is cover anything else of importance that you think somebody being introduced into energy policy needs to know. And then wrap us up with what can we do as individuals to help enact and affect stronger energy policy?
Great questions. I mean, everyone has a role to play in this. I mean, it is not one single company or one single entity that can build any of these technologies that we're talking about. There's not one single company that can meet the demand growth for electricity or for manufacturing or even be able to export globally. It's a big effort. And so I think as we move forward, it's going to be more and more important to pull in some of those different players. Great example down in Houston of the petrochemical companies learning about nuclear and what that looks like. You're seeing the big data center companies start talk with geothermal and some of the announcements out west with that. Some of the advancements around carbon capture, some of the new companies building long duration energy storage. And so how do you start more of these companies talking to each other? How do you start pulling in the different companies that build a lot of these big projects? How do you make sure the finance community is familiar with a lot of these new technologies being developed? And kind of all of that together is going to make anything successful. Moving then to the policy side, you know, policymakers love hearing from private industry about how important this company is for jobs in their district, in their state. And I think as we're moving forward, we're only going to see that continue as we have, dozens and dozens of companies looking to build all over the country.
What really hit home with me, I can't remember which Texas senator threw up a welcome mat literally at the conference to say, all of you nuclear folk, come here. We need you to build here. We need the power. I will make sure personally that we get the right policy in. And that was where I was like, okay, it's super serious about getting the right policy engaged to welcome these new technologies. Nico, it's been a pleasure hosting you. We will have you back for a 200 level at some point, I am sure. But thank you, everybody who listened. I hope you learned a little bit about a lot in energy policy. And as always, stay happy, but most importantly, stay safe. Nico, do you have any last words?
No, thank you for having me.
Energy policy is not as scary as I originally thought it was. I am not one to really promote my political savviness because I hadn't recognized that part of it through my journey. I am not one who is political in nature, and so I had always associated policy with politics. And I'm just grateful that I've started to open my eyes, and hopefully, this episode has opened up a couple other people's eyes in the sense that if we want to innovate and deliver a more sustainable world, we do have to have the energy policy aligned with our goals and ambitions. So, if you have any comments or connections, please don't hesitate to reach out to me on LinkedIn, Marcia Leonard, Marcia, and enjoy this wonderful, wonderful week ahead of us.